The late evening sky was cast in shades of indigo and violet, the city cloaked in an almost surreal quietness. On the edge of one of the city's more troubled districts, a single ambulance moved through the dimly lit streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. Inside sat Jessica Moore, a seasoned black female paramedic known for her calm, collected demeanor. Jessica had been on the job for over a decade, and through that time, she'd learned to handle everything from routine calls to violent emergencies with a kind of grace and grit that had earned her respect among her peers. Tonight, however, she could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the usual restlessness of the city, something felt off. Seated beside her was Sam Lopez, her partner of 2 years. Sam was younger, in his early 30s, and though he had experience, he often looked to Jessica for guidance in tough situations. Their partnership was built on a mutual trust, and though they didn't always need words to communicate, Sam could tell by Jessica's silence that she was preparing herself for whatever lay ahead. Their call was to a seemingly abandoned building on the edge of the neighborhood, where someone had reported a serious injury. Dispatch had been vague about the details, simply mentioning that someone inside needed immediate medical assistance. Jessica's instincts told her this was likely more than just an accident. They pulled up to the building, a decrepit structure that looked like it hadn't seen upkeep in years. Broken windows, graffiti-stained walls, and piles of trash littered the entrance. As they stepped out of the ambulance, Jessica noticed the eerie silence around them. There were no bystanders, no curious onlookers, only the faint hum of streetlights and the rustling of the wind. Her pulse quickened slightly, but she remained composed, signaling to Sam to grab their medical bags. They were just approaching the entrance when they heard the distant sound of footsteps. Out of the darkness, a police car rolled up slowly, its headlights casting an ominous glow. The car came to a stop, and out stepped Officer Ryan Steele. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a permanent scowl etched across his face, Steele was known in the precinct as a man who took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. His interactions with the public, especially with people he deemed suspicious, often escalated unnecessarily. He carried with him an air of authority that bordered on aggression, his blue eyes narrowing in suspicion at anything that didn't fit his rigid sense of order. Tonight, seeing Jessica and Sam standing at the entrance of the building, he felt an immediate unease. Steele's steps were heavy as he approached, his gaze locked on Jessica with an intensity that she couldn't ignore. She braced herself, already sensing that this encounter might be more trouble than it was worth. She could see the assumptions forming in his eyes, the conclusions he'd already drawn before she had even spoken. Despite her uniform and medical bag, despite the ambulance parked nearby, she could see he didn't view her as someone who was here to help. "What are you doing here?" Steele's tone was accusatory, sharp. He barely looked at Sam, his focus entirely on Jessica. Jessica held her ground, refusing to let his tone unsettle her. "We're responding to an emergency call. Someone inside is injured and needs medical attention." Steele's eyes narrowed further, as if he didn't believe her. "This area is under surveillance," he said, his voice cold. "There's been a lot of trouble around here. Break-ins, drug deals, assaults. And I don't recognize you from this neighborhood." Jessica took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had encountered officers like Steele before, those who viewed her presence in certain areas as inherently suspicious. She'd learned over the years how to handle such situations with calm professionalism, but tonight, under the weight of Steele's unyielding stare, it felt different. There was a hostility in his eyes, a disdain that was almost palpable. "We're here to do our job," Officer Jessica replied, keeping her tone steady. "Someone's life may be at risk. If you'd like, you can stay and observe, but please allow us to enter." Steele's lips twisted into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. I don't think you understand. Ma'am, he said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound like an insult. I don't need your permission to be here, and I'm not convinced that you're here to help anyone. How about you show me some ID? Jessica clenched her jaw, but she complied, pulling out her identification. She handed it to Steele, watching as he examined it with a dismissive glance. He didn't look at her medical credentials or her paramedic certification, only at her name, as if that alone would confirm his suspicions. Jessica Moore, he muttered, the disdain still evident in his tone. And you, he pointed a finger at Sam. What's your name? Sam Lopez, he replied, his voice cautious. Sam could sense the growing tension, and though he tried to keep his face neutral, he felt a flash of anger at the way Steele was treating Jessica. She was the most competent and dedicated person he'd ever worked with, and yet here was this officer, reducing her to little more than a suspect. Steele handed Jessica's ID back with a sneer. Fine, but don't think I'm letting you out of my sight. I don't know what's going on in there, but if I catch you doing anything suspicious, he let the sentence hang, the implied threat clear. Jessica forced herself to stay calm. She didn't want to escalate the situation, especially with someone in need of medical help just inside. She nodded to Sam, signaling for them to move forward. Steele followed a few paces behind, his gaze never leaving her. Jessica could feel the weight of his scrutiny, each step filling her with a sense of dread. She knew that if Steele was watching her every move, any small action could be misinterpreted, twisted to fit his assumptions. As they entered the dimly lit building, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and dust. The interior was dark, with only a few flickering lights illuminating the hallway. Jessica scanned the surroundings, trying to focus on finding the injured person, but Steele's presence loomed like a dark cloud. She could hear his footsteps behind her, heavy and purposeful, as if he were ready to pounce at the first sign of trouble. They reached a staircase, and Jessica glanced at Sam. The call said they were on the second floor, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam nodded, but before they could ascend, Steele interjected. I'll go first. Don't want you two getting any ideas. His tone was laced with suspicion, as though he thought they might try to slip away. Jessica bit back a response, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. Instead, she followed behind him, her mind focused on the task at hand. Her heart pounded as they climbed the stairs, each step echoing ominously through the silent building. At the top, they found a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. Steele motioned for them to stay back as he slowly approached one of the doors, his hand hovering over his holster. Jessica exchanged a look with Sam, silently urging him to remain calm. She could feel her own nerves fraying, but she knew that showing any sign of agitation would only feed Steele's paranoia. After a moment, Steele pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room where a figure lay sprawled on the floor. Jessica's professional instincts kicked in immediately. She stepped forward, dropping to her knees beside the injured person, a man in his 50s, bleeding from a deep cut on his temple. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale and clammy. Jessica quickly assessed the situation, pulling out her medical equipment and beginning to administer first aid. As she worked, she could feel Steele's gaze boring into her back, his presence oppressive and unsettling. She knew that no matter what she did, he would be watching, waiting for any excuse to interfere. But Jessica refused to let his hostility deter her. She was here to save a life, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not even an aggressive cop with a chip on his shoulder, stand in her way. Jessica worked with swift, practiced movements, applying gauze to the injured man's temple as she checked his vitals. His pulse was weak but steady, and though his breathing was shallow, he was still hanging on. Sam moved to assist, handing her supplies and focusing on stabilizing the patient. The two had fallen into a seamless rhythm, one honed over countless emergencies, but tonight was different. The air was charged with tension, made worse by the oppressive presence of Officer Steele, who watched every move as though he expected them to turn on him. Steele shifted, his hand resting on his holster, his eyes never leaving Jessica. To him, there was something unsettling about this woman, her confidence, her unwillingness to shrink under his gaze. In his mind, he had already decided that there was something off about her, something dangerous that needed to be controlled. Jessica could feel his gaze burning into her, and she knew what he was thinking. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone who couldn't comprehend that she, a black woman, was a professional here to do her job. As she continued her work, Steele took a step closer, breaking the silence. "Who exactly called you here?" he asked, his tone sharp, as though he was conducting an interrogation rather than standing on the sidelines of a medical emergency. Jessica didn't look up, her hands steady as she checked the man's pupils with a small flashlight. "We were dispatched here. The call came through as a medical emergency." Steele huffed, clearly dissatisfied with her answer. "I'm not sure I believe," that he said slowly, almost as if he was savoring the distrust in his own voice. "You're telling me that in this part of town, at this hour, someone just happened to call for a paramedic, and you just happened to show up?" Jessica finally looked up, meeting his eyes with a steady, unwavering gaze. She kept her tone calm and professional. "Yes, officer, that's exactly what happened. Someone needed medical assistance, and we responded. This is our job." Steele's expression twisted with irritation, as though her calmness was a personal affront. He took another step closer, towering over her, trying to assert his dominance. "I think you should step away from him," he said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. "Let me see what you're really up to." Jessica's patience, carefully maintained throughout this tense encounter, began to fray. She was here to save a life, not to satisfy the suspicions of an overzealous cop with an attitude. She kept her voice level, her tone as controlled as she could manage. "Officer Steele, this man is injured and needs medical attention. If we don't act quickly, he could go into shock. Please allow us to do our job." Steele's eyes narrowed. I said, "Step away." His hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing the handle of his taser. The gesture wasn't lost on Jessica. It was a warning, a reminder of his authority, a signal that he could escalate this situation with a single movement. Sam, sensing the mounting tension, cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. "Officer Steele, we're really just here to help. We have a job to do, and time is critical. We don't want any trouble." But Steele wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on Jessica, his jaw clenched. "I've dealt with people like you before," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for them both to hear. "You think you're above the law? That you can do whatever you want just because you wear a uniform? Well, that doesn't work with me." Jessica's patience finally snapped. She rose to her feet, standing directly in front of Steele, refusing to let him intimidate her. "With all due respect, Officer Steele, we are licensed paramedics, and our priority is saving lives. If you're here to assist, we welcome it. But if you're here to interfere, you're only putting this man's life in danger." Steele's face flushed with anger, and for a moment it looked like he was going to lash out. But instead, he let out a bitter laugh. "Saving lives? Is that what you call it?" He gestured at the man on the floor with a sneer. "You think I don't know what really goes on in places like this? Drug deals, gang wars? People who don't belong." Jessica's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to stay composed. "I don't know what you think goes on here, officer, but I do know that if you continue to obstruct us, this man might die." And if that happens, it will be on you. Steele took another step forward, closing the distance between them until they were nearly face to face. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried a venomous edge. Are you threatening me? Jessica held her ground. No, officer. I'm telling you the truth. Steele's hand tightened on his taser, and for a tense moment, Jessica wondered if he might actually use it. But before he could react, the injured man on the floor let out a low, pained groan. His eyes flickered open, and he looked up at Jessica, a faint glimmer of recognition in his gaze. The moment was brief, but it was enough to jolt Steele. He glanced down at the man, and his expression shifted slightly, as if he were finally seeing him as a person rather than a potential suspect. For a second, Steele hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face. Jessica seized the opportunity, crouching back down beside the patient. Sir, can you hear me? You're in safe hands. We're here to help you. The man nodded weakly, his eyes half closed. Please. Help me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sam knelt beside Jessica, handing her a fresh set of gauze. Together they worked quickly, ignoring Steele, who lingered uncertainly, clearly conflicted. Jessica could feel the tension in the room shifting, the dynamics subtly changing as Steele's bravado wavered. But the reprieve was short-lived. Steele shook his head, as though clearing away his doubts, and his face hardened once more. Enough of this, he snapped, his voice loud and harsh. I'm not going to let you two just walk away from this. This building is a known hotspot for crime, and I have every right to investigate what's going on here. So don't think you're above my authority. Jessica looked up, her patience worn thin. And I have every right to provide emergency medical care to this man. If you have a problem with that, officer, I suggest you take it up with the department. Steele's face twisted with rage. His hand left his taser, and before anyone could react, he lunged forward, grabbing Jessica's arm with a bruising grip. You think you're so smart, don't you? He hissed. You think you can just talk your way out of this. Jessica winced at the pain radiating from his grip, but she refused to show weakness. Officer Steele, let go of my arm. You're interfering with an emergency response. Sam, alarmed, reached out to intervene. Officer, please. But Steele ignored him, his gaze locked onto Jessica's with a burning intensity. You don't get to tell me what to do, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You're in my territory now. Jessica met his stare, her own gaze fierce and unyielding. I'm here to save a life, and I won't let you stand in the way of that. For a moment, they were locked in a silent battle of wills, each refusing to back down. Steele's grip tightened, and Jessica could feel the bruises forming under his fingers. But she didn't flinch, didn't look away. She knew that if she showed even a hint of fear, he would see it as a victory. Then, as suddenly as it had started, Steele released her, shoving her back with a rough motion. Jessica staggered but quickly regained her balance, her jaw set in defiance. Fine, Steele muttered, his voice cold and bitter. Do whatever you need to do. But know this, I'll be watching, and if I see anything out of place, you'll regret it. Jessica didn't respond. She simply turned her attention back to the injured man, resuming her work with renewed determination. She was shaken but unbroken, her resolve stronger than ever. As she worked, she could feel Steele's gaze on her, heavy and resentful, a promise of trouble yet to come. But Jessica pushed it from her mind. She had a job to do, and nothing, not even a hostile cop with a grudge, would stop her from fulfilling her duty. Jessica continued working with focused precision, blocking out the sting in her arm where Officer Steele had grabbed her. The injured man lay pale and barely conscious, and her mind was honed in on stabilizing him. Beside her, Sam maintained a steady hand, passing her medical supplies and keeping a careful eye on the patient's vitals. They both knew that time was running out. If they didn't get this man to a hospital soon, his condition could deteriorate rapidly. But Steele wasn't finished. Even as Jessica did her best to ignore him, he hovered nearby, his face twisted with suspicion. To him, there was something wrong, something inherently dangerous about these paramedics who dared to stand up to him. He had convinced himself that they were hiding something. The fact that Jessica hadn't shown any fear only fueled his anger. It was as if she didn't understand the power he held over her, the authority he could wield with a single word. Suddenly, Steele took a step forward, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "That's enough," he barked. "Step away from him." Jessica looked up, her patience stretched to its limit. "Officer Steele, this man's life is in danger. We need to get him stabilized and transported to a hospital. Please let us do our jobs." Steele's eyes flashed, and he folded his arms across his chest, clearly determined to make his authority known. "I'm not convinced you're actually here to help him," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "I think you're here for something else. Maybe hiding evidence, covering up a crime scene. People like you always have something to hide." Sam's face flushed with anger, but Jessica placed a calming hand on his arm, signaling him to stay quiet. She knew any response would only add fuel to Steele's fire. Taking a steadying breath, she turned her attention back to the injured man, her fingers working deftly to secure a bandage over his wound. Steele's patience, however, had worn thin. He reached down, yanking her hand away from the patient with a roughness that made her wince. "I said, step away," he shouted, his voice echoing off the grimy walls of the building. Jessica's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer Steele, if you continue to interfere, this man could die. Is that what you want?" Steele's face contorted with rage. He was so used to people bowing to his authority, to bending under his will. The defiance in Jessica's eyes felt like a challenge he couldn't ignore. Without warning, he reached down and grabbed her shoulder, jerking her to her feet. The sudden motion sent pain shooting through her body, but Jessica held back any sign of weakness. "You think you're in charge here?" Steele hissed, his face inches from hers. "You think you can just waltz into my jurisdiction and act like you own the place?" Jessica met his gaze, her eyes steely. "I think I'm here to save a life, Officer Steele, and your ego isn't going to stop me." That was it. The final straw. Steele's face turned a shade of red Jessica had never seen before, and before she could react, his fist connected with her face, the impact sending her staggering backward. She tasted blood, felt the sting in her cheek, but the pain was secondary to the shock and fury that welled up inside her. Sam cried out in horror, rushing to Jessica's side as she steadied herself. "Jessica, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern and anger. Jessica held up a hand, signaling him to stay back. She wiped the blood from her lip, her eyes never leaving Steele's face. "I'm fine, Sam," she said, her voice steady, though the anger in her tone was unmistakable. "But this has gone too far." Steele sneered at her, the twisted smile of a man who thought he'd won. "You people think you're untouchable," he spat. "Always trying to play the victim, always blaming others. Well, not on my watch." Jessica's fists clenched, and she took a slow, deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "You've crossed a line, Officer Steele. I have a job to do, and you're actively preventing me from doing it. You're not just interfering with an emergency response, you're endangering this man's life." Steele laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the empty hallway. "I don't care what you think, lady. This is my turf and I don't take orders from anyone, least of all you." Jessica felt a surge of frustration. She had encountered difficult officers before, but none as openly hostile as Steele. She glanced over at the injured man, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. If they didn't act soon, he wouldn't make it to the hospital in time. Her mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation, to get through to Steele, but she knew reason wasn't something he'd respond to. At that moment, a faint noise from behind them caught Steele's attention. He turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, eyes narrowed as he scanned the shadows. Jessica followed his gaze, realizing they weren't alone in the building. Another figure had appeared at the end of the hallway, a tall man with an intense, commanding presence. As the man stepped into the dim light, Jessica recognized him. Her heart sank as she realized who he was. Judge Harold Collins, one of the city's most respected and influential legal figures. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, a man who believed deeply in justice and the rule of law. His presence here was both a shock and a potential lifeline. Judge Collins took in the scene with a piercing gaze, his eyes moving from the injured man on the floor to Steele's clenched fist, and then to Jessica, whose face bore the fresh mark of Steele's violence. His expression darkened, a hint of disbelief mingling with anger. "Officer Steele," the judge said, his voice calm but laced with authority, "what exactly is going on here?" Steele faltered, caught off guard. His hand dropped from his gun, and for a moment he looked like a child caught doing something he knew was wrong. But then he straightened, regaining some of his bluster. "Sir, I'm handling a situation here," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "These paramedics were acting suspiciously. I was just making sure they weren't involved in anything illegal." Judge Collins's gaze hardened. "So you thought it was appropriate to assault a paramedic, to interfere with an emergency response?" Steele stammered, his bravado beginning to crumble under the weight of the judge's scrutiny. I was just doing my job, sir. There's been a lot of crime in this area, and I had reason to believe." Enough. The single word, spoken with quiet authority, cut Steele off mid-sentence. Judge Collins turned to Jessica, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, Ms. Moore?" Jessica nodded, swallowing the lingering pain in her face and focusing on the task at hand. "Yes, Judge Collins, thank you. But our patient here is in critical condition, and we need to get him to a hospital immediately." The judge nodded, his gaze moving back to Steele. "Then do your job, Ms. Moore." "And Officer Steele," he said, his voice cold and unyielding, "stand down. Now." Steele's face twisted with barely suppressed rage, but he nodded stiffly, stepping back. Jessica could see the hatred simmering in his eyes, the resentment that he couldn't openly express. But for the moment he was restrained, held in check by the presence of a man he could intimidate. Jessica returned to her work, feeling a renewed sense of urgency. She and Sam moved quickly, securing the patient onto a stretcher and preparing him for transport. Judge Collins watched in silence, his presence a reassuring anchor in the chaos. Every so often, Jessica would glance at Steele, who stood rigidly to the side, his face a mask of anger and humiliation. As they wheeled the patient toward the exit, Judge Collins walked alongside them, his gaze never leaving Steele. "Officer Steele," he said in a low, measured tone, "I will be filing a formal complaint regarding your conduct here tonight. Consider this a warning. If I hear even a whisper of behavior like this again, you will face consequences." Steele clenched his fists, but he said nothing, his jaw set in a tight line. Jessica could see the barely contained fury in his eyes, the way his body tensed as though he wanted to lash out. But he was trapped, caught between his anger and the authority of the judge, and he knew it. Outside, the ambulance awaited, its lights flashing softly in the night. Jessica and Sam loaded the patient into the back, their movements swift and practiced. Judge Collins stepped back, giving them room to work, but his presence lingered like a protective shield, a reminder that justice, though fragile, still held sway. As Jessica climbed into the ambulance, she gave the judge a grateful nod. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The judge inclined his head, his gaze steady. "You're welcome, Ms. Moore. I only did what was right. Remember, people like Steele thrive on fear. Don't let them intimidate you." Jessica nodded, her resolve strengthening under his words. She took her place beside the patient, ready to focus solely on saving his life, while Sam took the wheel. As they drove away, Jessica allowed herself a moment to process the events of the night. The pain in her face was still there, a reminder of Steele's cruelty, but she knew that tonight she hadn't just stood her ground, she had shown Steele that his prejudice couldn't break her spirit. In the rearview mirror, Steele stood alone in the darkness, his figure a stark silhouette against the flashing lights of the police car. Judge Collins's words still echoed in his ears, a reminder of the reckoning that awaited him. And for the first time in a long time, Steele felt a pang of fear, a fear that his power, his control, might not be as invincible as he'd always believed. The ambulance sped through the city streets, its sirens cutting through the night as Jessica worked tirelessly in the back to stabilize the patient. Judge Collins had slipped back into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and labored. Jessica's hands moved with practiced precision, her mind fully focused on the immediate task, keeping him alive until they reached the hospital. The events of the night replayed in flashes in her mind, the hostile confrontation with Steele, his unwarranted aggression, the punch that left a dull ache pulsing in her cheek. She hadn't had time to process any of it, her focus entirely on the patient. But now, as the ambulance raced toward the hospital, she felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. Steele had crossed a line, and she knew this encounter would leave a mark, both physically and emotionally. Beside her, Sam glanced at her with concern. He'd been silent for most of the ride, understanding the gravity of the situation, but he could see the tension in Jessica's face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica nodded, her gaze still on the patient. "I'm fine," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. There was a fire in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. This is different, Sam. He went too far tonight." Sam looked at her, seeing the intensity in her expression. He knew Jessica was tougher than most. She'd been through her share of hard calls and challenging situations, but something about this incident had struck a nerve. "We'll make sure this doesn't go unanswered," he said firmly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "What he did, it was wrong, and he's going to pay for it." Jessica nodded, grateful for Sam's support, but her attention quickly returned to Judge Collins. His condition was deteriorating, and she knew they didn't have much time. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, focusing entirely on keeping him stable. Her anger, though simmering beneath the surface, was temporarily set aside. Right now, the judge's life was in her hands. Finally, they reached the hospital. Jessica and Sam sprang into action, transferring Judge Collins onto a stretcher and wheeling him into the emergency room. Nurses and doctors gathered around, taking in his condition, and Jessica quickly relayed the details of his injuries, giving them all the information they needed. As they moved him into the operating room, Jessica stood back, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She had done everything she could, but the image of Steele's sneering face wouldn't leave her mind. She could still feel his grip on her arm, his contemptuous words echoing in her memory. She took a shaky breath, trying to ground herself, when a familiar voice pulled her out of her thoughts. Jessica. She looked up to see Dr. Angela Foster, one of the senior doctors in the emergency department and a close friend. Dr. Foster's face was etched with concern as she took in Jessica's disheveled appearance and the bruise forming on her cheek. "Oh my God, Jessica, what happened?" Dr. Foster asked, her voice filled with worry. Jessica hesitated, unsure how to begin. The events of the night felt surreal, almost too chaotic to put into words. But she knew she had to say something. It was Officer Steele. He interfered with our work. He actually hit me, Angela. He thought we were, I don't know, doing something illegal, I guess. It was completely out of control. Dr. Foster's eyes widened in shock, her expression shifting from concern to outrage. He hit you while you were trying to save a life? Jessica nodded, her jaw tight. Yes, and he tried to stop us from helping Judge Collins. If it wasn't for the judge himself stepping in, I don't know what might have happened. Dr. Foster shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. This is unacceptable. Jessica, you need to report this. You can't let him get away with this. Jessica let out a bitter laugh. Report it to who? His department. The same people who probably know exactly how he operates but turn a blind eye to it. Dr. Foster placed a comforting hand on Jessica's shoulder. I know it feels hopeless, but you're not alone in this. Judge Collins is a powerful figure. Once he recovers, he can help you bring this to light. Jessica nodded, a flicker of hope mingling with her frustration. I know. It's just. People like Steele have been getting away with this kind of behavior for too long. It feels like fighting a losing battle. Dr. Foster gave her a reassuring squeeze. Sometimes it takes a battle to change things. And if anyone can stand up to him, it's you. Jessica managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's support. But as she looked down the hallway, where Judge Collins was being prepped for surgery, a sense of unease gnawed at her. Steele wasn't the kind of man to back down. If anything, his encounter with Judge Collins might only fuel his resentment. As if on cue, Jessica's phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a text message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, her pulse quickening as she read the words. You think you're safe just because you ran off to the hospital. This isn't over. Watch yourself. Jessica's blood ran cold. She didn't need to guess who had sent it. Steele. The message was a chilling reminder that he wasn't finished with her, that his twisted sense of authority and control didn't end just because they'd escaped his immediate reach. She showed the message to Dr. Foster, her hands trembling. He's threatening me, Angela. Even after everything that's happened, he's still trying to intimidate me. Dr. Foster's face darkened. This is harassment, Jessica. You need to document everything, every text, every interaction. If he's willing to go this far, he's dangerous. Jessica nodded, swallowing hard. I know. But I can't let him win. I can't let him think he can silence me. Her voice grew stronger, filled with a determination that overshadowed her fear. I won't let him get away with this. Dr. Foster gave her a supportive nod. Good. And remember, you're not in this alone. We'll stand with you, whatever it takes. Jessica felt a surge of strength at her friend's words. She knew that Steele's threats were real, that his anger was far from over. But she also knew that backing down would only give him more power. She was determined to fight, no matter how daunting the battle seemed. Later that night, as Jessica sat in the hospital's quiet staff room, she reflected on the events of the evening. Steele's actions had shaken her, but they had also ignited something within her. A need for justice, for accountability not just for herself, but for every other person who had faced discrimination, hostility, or abuse of power. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos she'd taken of the bruises on her arm and cheek. Evidence, she thought. If this was going to be a fight, she would need every piece of evidence she could gather. And she knew that Judge Collins's testimony would be crucial. As soon as he was stable, she intended to speak with him, to discuss what had happened, and to enlist his support. The door to the staff room opened, and Sam stepped inside, a look of concern on his face. He had just finished filing the patient report, but he looked like he hadn't been able to shake the tension of the night. "Jessica, are you sure you're okay?" he asked softly, taking a seat across from her. "I mean, that was intense. Steele. He's dangerous." Jessica looked at him, seeing the worry in his eyes. She gave him a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm okay, Sam. But you're right. Steele is dangerous, and I think he's going to try to make things even harder for us now. He's not the kind of person to let something like this go." Sam nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then we fight back. We have the truth on our side, and I'm with you all the way." Jessica felt a wave of gratitude. In that moment she realized that, despite Steele's threats and the fear lingering in her mind, she wasn't alone. She had allies, people who believed in her, and who wouldn't let her face this battle on her own. As they sat in silence, the weight of the night slowly beginning to settle over them, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. Steele had tried to break her, to intimidate her into silence, but he had only succeeded in strengthening her resolve. She would stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or threatened by people like him. The road ahead was uncertain, and Jessica knew that Steele would likely retaliate, but she also knew that she couldn't, and wouldn't, back down. Her fight had only just begun. The next day, Jessica arrived at the hospital feeling a mix of exhaustion and determination. She hadn't slept much. Steele's threats lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear his venomous voice, feel the sting of his punch, and see the menacing text message on her phone. But as tired as she was, Jessica knew she couldn't afford to back down. Her commitment to standing up against him had only grown stronger overnight. In the hallway, Sam waited for her, his expression serious. "Hey," he said, his voice low as they walked toward the staff room. "I wanted to check in. Did you hear anything from Judge Collins?" Jessica shook her head. "Not yet. He's still recovering, but the doctors say he's stable. I'm hoping to speak with him as soon as he's able. His testimony will be crucial if we want to make sure Steele faces consequences for what he did." Sam nodded, though he looked troubled. "Jessica, I've been thinking. You know Steele won't take this lying down. He's already proven how far he's willing to go. What if he retaliates even harder?" Jessica gave a small, determined smile. "I've thought about that too, but I can't let him scare me into silence. If he thinks he can bully me into dropping this, he's got another thing coming." Their conversation was interrupted as Dr. Foster approached, a grim expression on her face. She nodded at Jessica and Sam, but her tone was urgent. "Jessica, you need to see this." She led them into a small office where a computer screen displayed footage from the hospital's security cameras. Dr. Foster pressed play, and Jessica's stomach tightened as she saw what appeared to be footage from the early hours of the morning. Steele, dressed in civilian clothes, was captured entering the hospital, making his way through the hallways with an intensity that looked out of place. He didn't approach any of the staff or patients. Instead, he moved purposefully, as if searching for something or someone. Jessica's eyes widened as she watched Steele turn a corner and disappear off camera near the ICU. Her heart sank. He was here? In the hospital? Why? Dr. Foster's expression hardened. "That's what I'd like to know. He shouldn't have been here, especially after what happened last night. This isn't just harassment, it's stalking. Sam clenched his fists, his face a mask of anger. This guy is out of control. He knows he crossed the line, and now he's trying to intimidate you, even here. Jessica's mind raced. Why would Steele be at the hospital? Was he trying to confront her? Or was he looking for Judge Collins, perhaps intending to pressure or threaten him before he could recover enough to speak out? "We need to report this," Jessica said, her voice steely. "He's escalating, and it's only a matter of time before he tries something worse. He's making it clear that he won't let this go." Dr. Foster nodded. "I agree. I'll speak to hospital security and we'll submit a formal complaint. This is a clear violation, and the hospital won't tolerate it. In the meantime, Jessica, I want you to be careful. Steele seems unpredictable, and we can't underestimate how far he might go." Jessica took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fear that had been gnawing at her now transformed into a cold, determined resolve. Steele might be relentless, but so was she. She was tired of living in fear, of dealing with people who thought they could wield power to control and intimidate. This was personal now, not just for her, but for every patient and colleague who relied on her. She had a duty to see this through. Later that day, Jessica decided to check on Judge Collins, who had finally been moved out of the ICU into a private recovery room. The sight of him, pale but awake, brought a wave of relief. She knocked gently on the door before entering, giving him a warm smile. "Judge Collins," she said softly, "I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" The judge looked up, his gaze sharp despite his weakened state. "Jessica, isn't it? Thank you for what you did. I owe you my life." Jessica shook her head modestly. "Just doing my job, sir. But there's something you should know. The officer who attacked me last night, Officer Steele, he's not finished. He's been harassing me ever since, and I have reason to believe he may have even come to the hospital last night to intimidate us." A flicker of anger crossed Judge Collins's face. "He came here? That man is audacious. This behavior cannot be allowed to continue." Jessica felt a surge of hope. "I was hoping to ask for your support, sir. Your testimony could make all the difference in holding him accountable. With your influence, we might finally be able to expose him for the bully he is." The judge nodded firmly. "You have my full support, Jessica. This man represents everything that is wrong with the system. I will not stand by and let him harm you or anyone else. When I am well enough, I'll make sure he faces the consequences of his actions." As she left the judge's room, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight, and with Judge Collins's backing, Steele's reign of terror might finally come to an end. But even as her confidence grew, a nagging sense of unease lingered. Steele wasn't the type to simply back down, especially when cornered. Just as Jessica turned a corner in the hospital hallway, her phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. This time, the message was more direct. "You think you've won just because you have a few people on your side. I'll make sure you regret this." Her heart pounded, a cold wave of fear washing over her. She showed the text to Sam, who frowned, his jaw tightening in anger. "This is harassment. Plain and simple," he muttered. "We should take this to the police." Jessica shook her head. "The police? Steele's part of that system. Who knows how many friends he has in the department who'll back him up. We need to approach this strategically." They sat in a quiet corner of the hospital, their voices hushed but filled with urgency. Jessica's mind raced as she considered their options. Going to the authorities might expose Steele, but it could also backfire if his colleagues protected him. She needed undeniable proof, something so compelling that even his allies couldn't defend him. Sam looked at her, his expression resolute. Then let's get that proof. If Steele thinks he can intimidate you, he's wrong. We'll gather everything we need to expose him. Jessica nodded, her mind made up. You're right, we document everything. Every text, every message, and if he shows up here again, we make sure there's evidence. They spent the next few days on high alert. Jessica continued her shifts, though her mind was always partially focused on Steele and his possible next move. Sam, ever watchful, stayed close whenever he could, providing her with a sense of security in a situation that felt increasingly precarious. On the fourth night after the incident, as Jessica was finishing up a late shift, she received a message from the hospital's security team. Steele had been seen lurking near the hospital entrance, and security had intervened, warning him that his presence was unwelcome. Jessica's stomach churned. The fact that he was so close, so relentless in his pursuit, sent a chill down her spine. It was well past midnight, and the streets were empty as she left the hospital, Sam by her side. They both knew Steele's aggression had escalated, and there was no telling what he might do next. Sam had insisted on walking her to her car, and she was grateful for his presence. As they approached her car, however, the silence around them felt heavy, charged with a sense of impending danger. Jessica's heart raced, her instincts kicking in as she scanned the area. And then she saw him, Steele, leaning casually against his own car parked just across the lot, his expression smug, his eyes fixed on her. Leaving so late, he called out, his tone mocking. That's dangerous, you know. You never know who might be lurking around at this hour. Jessica felt a flash of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. What do you want, Steele? He straightened up, strolling toward them with a swagger that made her skin crawl. Just making sure you understand the situation, Jessica, he said, his voice low and menacing. I don't like loose ends, and I don't like people who think they can undermine my authority. Sam stepped forward, his stance protective. Back off, Steele. This is harassment, and you know it. Steele laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Harassment? No, I'm just looking out for her, making sure she stays safe. After all, a woman like her, making enemies in the wrong places, it wouldn't end well. Jessica's hands clenched, her pulse pounding in her ears. I'm not afraid of you, Steele. Your threats mean nothing to me. He moved closer, his eyes glinting with malice. Oh, you should be afraid, Jessica, because I'm not going anywhere. And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you regret it. Sam took a step between them, his voice firm. Enough. We're documenting everything, Steele, every threat, every interaction. You're only digging your own grave. Steele's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he looked between them. Fine. Document all you want, but remember, the police protect their own. And people like you, he sneered, people like you don't stand a chance. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jessica and Sam standing in the empty parking lot, the weight of his threat hanging heavy in the air. As they watched him drive off, Jessica felt a surge of both fear and resolve. Steele might be protected by the system, but she was determined to fight back with everything she had. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Several days later, Jessica found herself back at the hospital, trying to focus on her work, but feeling Steele's presence haunting her at every turn. Though she hadn't seen him since the confrontation in the parking lot, his threats lingered, a dark cloud casting shadows over her every move. She was on edge, her instincts telling her that he was planning something, biding his time until the perfect moment to strike. As she completed a round with her patients, she received an urgent message from Dr. Foster to meet her in a small conference room. Jessica's stomach tightened with unease as she made her way there, her mind racing through possibilities. When she entered, she found Dr. Foster, Sam, and an unfamiliar man in a suit, standing by a large screen displaying security footage from the hospital. "Jessica, thank you for coming," Dr. Foster greeted her, her expression tense but determined. She gestured to the man beside her. "This is Detective Howard. He's with Internal Affairs. We've shown him the footage of Steele's behavior in the hospital, and he wants to talk to you." Detective Howard nodded, his face serious. "MS. More. I've been briefed on your situation. We've received several complaints about Officer Steele recently, but your case is the most documented. The texts, the video footage, and Judge Collins's statement all point to a pattern of intimidation and abuse. We're ready to move forward with an investigation, but we need one last piece of evidence, something undeniable." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had been documenting Steele's harassment meticulously, but to know that Internal Affairs was finally ready to take action was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension she felt. Detective Howard glanced at Dr. Foster and Sam before replying, his tone cautious. "We believe Steele may try to contact you again, either here or outside the hospital. If he does, we need you to record the encounter. We'll have officers nearby, ready to intervene if things escalate. But we need clear, indisputable evidence of him threatening you in real time." Jessica's pulse quickened. The idea of facing Steele again was daunting, but she understood the necessity. This was her chance to finally hold him accountable, to stop his reign of terror, not just for herself but for anyone else he might victimize. She nodded, determination hardening in her expression. "I'll do it. I'm ready." That evening, Jessica left the hospital later than usual, her steps echoing through the near-empty parking lot. She scanned her surroundings, hyper-aware of every shadow, every distant sound. Her phone was in her pocket, ready to record at the first sign of Steele. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, the tension building as she waited. And then she saw him. Steele's figure emerged from the darkness, leaning casually against his car with that same smug expression she had come to know too well. He pushed off the car as she approached, blocking her path with an arrogance that made her blood boil. She took a steadying breath, subtly pressing the record button on her phone without breaking eye contact. Well, Steele sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still working late, Jessica? You'd think someone would have warned you by now about the dangers of being alone at night." Jessica kept her expression neutral, refusing to show any fear. "What do you want, Steele? Haven't you done enough?" Steele's smile twisted into a snarl. "I warned you to drop this, didn't I? But you just don't listen. I guess you think you're some kind of hero, trying to stand up to me." Jessica held her ground, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just doing my job, Steele. The real question is why you're so obsessed with trying to stop me. What are you afraid of?" Steele's eyes darkened, his hand twitching slightly as though he were barely restraining himself. "Afraid? Of you? Don't flatter yourself. People like you need to be reminded of their place. You think you can just walk around acting like you own the world, but I know exactly what you are." Jessica's heart pounded, but she didn't let his words shake her. "And what is that, Steele? Someone who won't tolerate your abuse of power. Someone who refuses to be intimidated by a bully." Steele's face twisted in fury, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You really think you can get away with this? With ruining my reputation? I have friends in the department, people who would gladly look the other way. No one's going to believe you over me." Jessica met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "I don't need people to believe me. I just need the truth, and it's all right here." She patted her pocket, where her phone continued to record every word. For a brief moment, Steele's confidence wavered, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. But he quickly masked it with a sneer, stepping closer, his voice low and filled with barely contained rage. "You think a little recording is going to stop me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." But before he could say another word, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the parking lot. Detective Howard and two officers appeared, their expressions hard as they approached Steele, who quickly took a step back, his bravado faltering. "Officer Steele," Detective Howard announced, his voice carrying authority and finality. "We have more than enough evidence of your misconduct and harassment. You are under investigation, and any further actions will only add to the charges against you." Steele's face drained of color, his confidence crumbling as the reality of the situation sank in. This is ridiculous. I'm the one being harassed here. She's lying." Detective Howard raised an eyebrow, unfazed by Steele's outburst. "We've documented everything, officer. The texts, the footage, Judge Collins's statement, and now this recording. It's over. I suggest you cooperate." Steele's eyes darted wildly between Jessica, the detective, and the officers, desperation etched across his face. "This isn't right. I was just doing my job. She's the one who provoked me." Jessica watched him, feeling a sense of justice, though tempered by sadness at the depth of his corruption. She had hoped for accountability, and now, finally, it was within reach. Detective Howard gave Steele one last stern look. "We'll see about that during the investigation. But for now, you're suspended, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon." Steele's face contorted with rage, but he had no choice. Reluctantly, he unhooked his badge and handed it over, his hands shaking with anger. He looked at Jessica one last time, his eyes filled with venom. "You'll pay for this more. One way or another." Jessica met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Steele, this is on you, and I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." With that, Steele was escorted away, his career in tatters, his power stripped away. Jessica let out a shaky breath, the weight of the confrontation finally hitting her. She felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and triumph. Steele's reign of intimidation had come to an end, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. Detective Howard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Jessica. This took courage. People like Steele rely on fear to keep people quiet, but you broke that cycle." Jessica nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I just wanted him to stop hurting people." Howard nodded, understanding, "And he won't anymore. People like him are a blight on the system, but it's people like you who make a difference. Don't forget that." As she walked back to her car, Jessica felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Steele's intimidation had haunted her, but she had stood her ground, fought back, and won. And though the journey had been painful, she knew that speaking out was worth it. She had exposed a man who had wielded power to harm others, and she had protected herself and those who might have been his next victims. She sat in her car for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of it all. It wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been forced to endure abuse of power. Steele's downfall was proof that justice, though sometimes elusive, could prevail. And as she drove home, Jessica felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in days. She had stood up to a bully and, in doing so, had reclaimed her voice, her strength, and her dignity. The next few weeks brought a mix of emotions for Jessica. Steele's suspension turned into a full investigation, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The recordings, Judge Collins's testimony, and the documented harassment were all irrefutable. With internal affairs digging deeper, other cases of Steele's misconduct began to surface, showing a pattern of intimidation and abuse that stretched back years. It was only now, as his record was fully exposed, that Jessica realized the extent of his cruelty. Though the relief of Steele's removal was palpable, Jessica still carried the weight of the ordeal. She often replayed the events in her mind, the moments of fear and anger, the feeling of his grip on her arm, and the tension in each of their encounters. But she reminded herself that her courage had led to real change. Steele would no longer hold sway over her or anyone else. One afternoon, as Jessica was wrapping up her shift, she received a message from Judge Collins, who had fully recovered. He invited her to meet him at a nearby coffee shop. Curious, she agreed, arriving to find the judge seated at a quiet corner table, a warm smile on his face as he stood to greet her. "Jessica," he said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you under better circumstances." She smiled, shaking his hand warmly. "Likewise, Judge Collins. I'm glad to see you're well." They sat down, and for a moment they simply exchanged pleasantries, but Jessica could sense there was more he wanted to say. Finally, he leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "I wanted to thank you," he began, "for not only saving my life but for standing up when it mattered. People like Steele have survived in the system for too long because so many of us look the other way. But you didn't. You had the courage to confront him, to expose him." Jessica felt a surge of gratitude, though she downplayed it with a modest smile. "I just couldn't let him keep hurting people, especially after what he did to you and me. I didn't think it would go this far, but I'm glad it did." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Well, it did go far, and it's had a ripple effect. Steele's case has led to calls for reform within the department. They're re-evaluating cases he was involved in, and other officers have come forward with their own concerns. Your bravery has inspired others to speak up." Jessica's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time, she fully understood the impact of her actions. What she had done wasn't just about her own safety, it had opened doors for others to find justice and reclaim their voices. Judge Collins gave her a thoughtful look. "Jessica, I wanted to speak with you because I think your voice is important. We need people like you within the system, advocating for accountability and integrity. Have you ever thought about working in advocacy, using your experience to help others?" Jessica was taken aback. The idea had never crossed her mind, but as she considered it, she realized how meaningful that path could be. She had always been committed to helping others, to saving lives in immediate, physical ways. But perhaps her experiences had prepared her for something bigger, for a role in changing the system itself. "It's something I'll think about," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "If what happened with Steele can lead to real change, then maybe that's a path worth considering." The judge nodded approvingly. "Take your time, but know that you have people who support you, including myself. And if you ever need a recommendation or someone to back you, I'm here." They finished their coffee, and Jessica left with a renewed sense of purpose. The idea of using her voice for greater change resonated with her, and as she walked through the city streets, she thought about all the people Steele had hurt over the years, people who may have never spoken up out of fear. She realized that her journey wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who'd been silenced by those in power. Back at the hospital, her colleagues greeted her with warm smiles and congratulations. Word had spread about Steele's downfall, and Jessica's actions had not only earned her respect, but had also created a ripple of empowerment among the staff. Some of her colleagues approached her privately, sharing their own experiences with bias and mistreatment, and she listened, realizing how deeply ingrained these issues were. That evening, as she sat in her apartment, Jessica reflected on everything that had happened. Her face had healed, but the memory of Steele's aggression was still fresh. Yet instead of feeling bitterness, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had faced something ugly, something that had tried to break her, and she had emerged stronger, with a new sense of purpose. Jessica opened her laptop and began drafting an article apiece about the importance of speaking out against abuse of power. She recounted her experiences, not in anger, but in the hope that others would be inspired to take a stand. As her words filled the screen, she felt a weight lifting, replaced by a sense of freedom and empowerment. The article was published a few weeks later, gaining traction in local news and online. Messages poured in from people who resonated with her story, who thanked her for her courage, who shared their own struggles. Jessica felt both humbled and empowered, realizing that her voice had made a difference, reaching people she would never meet but who would carry her message forward. As the weeks turned into months, Jessica continued her work as a paramedic, but now she was also a voice in her community, advocating for justice and integrity within the system. She was invited to speak at events, to participate in discussions about reform, and she took each opportunity with the same dedication she brought to her work as a paramedic. Steele was formally dismissed from the police force, his reputation in ruins. The city council, pressured by public demand, introduced new policies for accountability, ensuring officers like him would face real consequences. The impact of Jessica's actions rippled through the community, a lasting reminder of the power of one person's courage. And as Jessica moved forward, she carried with her the lessons of her journey, not only the pain and fear, but also the strength and resilience she had found within herself. She had faced down darkness, and in doing so, had become a beacon for others, a symbol of hope and the promise of change. In the end, Jessica knew that while her path hadn't been easy, it had led her to a place of purpose she hadn't anticipated. And as she continued her work, both as a paramedic and an advocate, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had turned her struggle into a force for good, a legacy of courage, integrity, and justice that would inspire others long after her story was told.